This week in Idaho, Trump expands the U.S. military's presence at the southern border as crossings decline. 2 Idaho firefighters are killed in a tragic ambush. And Gates steps in after RFK Jr. cuts U.S. vaccine funding internationally. Plus, Kohberger accepts a plea deal, shocking Idahoans. That and so much more. We got a packed one this week. This is the Yocal Idaho Midweek Report. We're giving you an overview of the news in Idaho for the last week. Welcome, happy pre-4th of July. This isn't coming out right on the 4th, but you may be listening to it at that time. So we want to wish you a very happy 4th of July. Hopefully you have plenty of wonderful plans for our country's birthday. I know it's one of my favorite holidays up there with Christmas and Easter. Hopefully you have some great food coming your way, some home-cooked apple pie or cherry pie. I don't know. You'll have to comment down below which one's more 4th of July or American. I would say apple pie. Some people would say cherry pie because it's red. I don't know. You'll have to convince me over to the cherry pie category. But also, I hope you had some good conversations, or will have some, depending on when you're listening to this. The holiday is a wonderful one to remember American pastimes, particularly the war ones if we're guys, and maybe the beautiful history that we as a culture have. And also, most importantly of all of that, hopefully you got to blow some stuff up, making some beautiful colors in the sky. And please don't start any more forest fires. We don't need that. Don't need any more of that. It wouldn't be America's birthday if we didn't blow some stuff up, because it's pretty American. Granted, if all those things aren't in the cards for you this year and you just had to go out and enjoy the beauty of other people's fireworks, maybe consider a nice movie and some food. I know some of the introverts out there and homebodies would much prefer to stay home, or the fireworks are just a little too much. So maybe watch The Patriot. I will recommend that. It's a very good movie. Just can't recommend it enough. Then if you want something that's a little bit more World War II, Midway, I've seen that. The more modern one, I think there may be a intermediary there, is very good. And then Saving Private Ryan is also a great pick to remember our country's birthday. Or you can share your favorite down below. Or I should say or. I didn't think far ahead of my script. So we can know about all the wonderful movies that we can enjoy for this holiday. And speaking of sharing things, this week we have a very, and I mean very full episode. First half, we have Trump locking down the southern border even more, the tragic deaths of 2 Idaho firefighters that were gunned down, plus Gates and vaccines. Those things go hand in hand, and plus Kohberger taking a plea deal. There's some controversy with that one. And then for the middle, abortion is back in the headlines. We've got 2 stories on that. The ACLU sues Idaho's immigration enforcement, or just sues us again. The ACLU has a habit there. And Trump defends our dams and expands logging here in Idaho. And then to close out, we have an update on the Victor Perez case. Man, we have a lot of law enforcement related stories today. Boise updates their code for new homeless ban. And Micron breaks record earnings. So we'll have all that and more. So please stay with us to the end of the show so you can catch that and so much more. But with any further ado, here is our first story. President Trump continues to expand how our military secures the southern border. The Pentagon has created 4 military zones where troops can detain people who cross illegally. These zones now stretch across 250 miles in Texas, plus areas in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Wonder how they swung that. Nearly 9,000 active duty personnel now patrol the border, compared to traditional support roles that troops played before. Defense Secretary Hegseth deployed a 3,000-member strike brigade combat team with armored vehicles to reinforce border operations. The military zones transform federal land into national defense areas, where border crossers face federal trespassing charges with up to 18 months in prison. Over 1,400 immigrants have been charged under these new rules. Trump has also directed the military to prepare Guantanamo Bay to hold 30,000 criminal illegal aliens who pose the greatest threats. The administration considers this necessary because some criminals are too dangerous for other countries to hold. This expansion tests the Posse Comitatus Act, which limits military involvement in domestic law enforcement. However, and the two of these may be tied together, border crossings have actually decreased dramatically this year as military presence grows. Maybe a little bit of an indicator on that one. And speaking of law enforcement and coming back to Idaho with the big story that's been buzzing, this past Sunday, evil struck our state when a gunman ambushed firefighters responding to a wildfire on Canfield Mountain near Coeur. 2 firefighters died and another was seriously wounded in what authorities believe was a deliberate trap. The suspect, a 20-year-old Wes Rowley of Coeur, apparently set the fire intentionally to lure out our first responders into danger. Around 1:21 p.m., crews from Coeur Fire Department and Kootenai County Fire and Rescue rushed to help, only to face gunfire 40 minutes later. Over 300 law enforcement officers from across the region, including FBI agents, responded to protect our firefighters and stop the shooting. They found Rowley's body on the mountain with a rifle nearby that evening. What makes this tragedy especially heartbreaking is that Rowley's grandfather says the young man had expressed interest in becoming a forest fighter himself. He worked for a tree company and had moved to Idaho recently, trying to figure out his life. Governor Little, for his part, called this attack heinous, end quote, and asked all Idahoans to pray for the families. County Commissioner Chairman Bruce Mater said this senseless violence does not reflect who we are as a community. The injured firefighter remains in stable condition after surgery. There was a total of 3, so 2 fatalities, 1 heavily injured. Our hearts and prayers go out to the families who lost their heroes while they served and protected us. These men ran towards danger to keep us safe. May we not take their sacrifice lightly. And speaking of health and protecting it, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced this last week that America will stop sending money to Gavi, the vaccine alliance, until the organization, quote, re-earns public trust, end quote. Kennedy criticized Gavi for ignoring vaccine safety concerns and making questionable recommendations about COVID-19 shots. In response, the Gates Foundation quickly stepped in to fill the gap. Bill Gates committed $1.6 billion over 5 years to support Gavi's work in poor countries. This comes after the Trump administration cut America's annual $300 million contribution to the group. Kennedy challenged Gavi to justify the $8 billion that Americans have provided since 2001, saying the group ignored science when it was inconvenient. He wants them to take vaccine safety seriously and consider all available research, even when, it may contradict established thinking. The Gates Foundation has now given about $7.7 billion to Gavi over 25 years, making the largest private donor. Gavi hopes to raise about $9 billion total for its next 5 years alone. My goodness, can we only just talk about billions? What happened to millions? Must be inflation. The shift puts private money in the place of taxpayer dollars for global vaccine programs, a change many Americans may welcome as we question how our government spends overseas. And speaking of someone avoiding death that some think shouldn't, Brian Kohberger accepted a plea deal yesterday that will spare him from execution for killing 4 University of Idaho students. The 30-year-old will plead guilty to all charges today and receive 4 consecutive life sentences without parole. Kohberger, according to the courts, stabbed 3 students to death in their Moscow home on November 13, 2022. Police arrested him 6 weeks later in Pennsylvania after DNA evidence linked him to a knife sheath found at the crime scene. The plea deal came just weeks before his trial was set to begin in August. You may remember this from our last week's report. Prosecutors approached the victim's family last Friday about the possibility, but many were caught off guard by Monday's announcement. The Goncalves family expressed fury at the state's prosecutors, saying they, quote, failed us, end quote, and handled the deal secretively. Stephen Goncalves called it, quote, the opposite of what we wanted, end quote. However, Madison Mogen's father, Ben, said he felt relieved, stating that they could, quote, put this behind us, end quote. Under the agreement, Kohberger waives all appeal rights and will serve 10 years for burglary. Prosecutors said this ensures he spends his entire life in prison without putting families through decades of appeals. The case shocked the small college town of Moscow and drew national attention, as you may remember. Today's hearing will formally end the case that has haunted Idaho for over 2 years now, though it leaves some families feeling that justice was not fully served. If you liked our first lineup of stories and they were informative for you and you didn't know about them, please hit the like button. Also consider subscribing/following by hitting the button on YouTube, Rumble, or Twitter so you can hear all this news regularly and the big stories that are happening in Idaho each week. And then speaking of a little bit more of a controversial form of death, last Friday, pro-abortion advocates launched their campaign to overturn our state's life-protecting laws. Idahoans United for Women and Families held a rally at the Capitol, kicking off their drive to collect 66,000 signatures for a November 2026 ballot measure. As for the group's goals, they want to return Idaho to the Roe v. Wade, we would argue failed Roe v. Wade framework, that allowed abortion up to fetal viability. Basically just saying that you could kill the baby right up to the point that it totally could live outside the womb. Their initiative would undo protections that we've built for unborn children and mothers facing difficult pregnancies. For context, this push comes as pro-life laws gain strength nationwide. The Supreme Court continues to deliver victories for life advocates, more on that in the next story, so stay with us, and Planned Parenthood faces more clinic closures across America. Yet despite this obvious kind of momentum, abortion proponents persist in their efforts to expand what they call reproductive freedom. The initiative, though, must survive Attorney General Labrador's review process, which has already forced revisions to their ballot language after legal challenges. If you want more on that, go check our last week's midweek report. The group claims over 1,000 volunteers will gather signatures across our 35 legislative districts. While 14 states have passed similar measures since Dobbs, Idaho remains committed to protecting life. Our state allows exemptions for rape, incest, and maternal life threats. These activists want to eliminate these careful protections we've established. And as I hinted at last Thursday, the Supreme Court delivered a significant victory for taxpayers and families in a 6 in favor, 3 against decision that allows states to block Medicaid payments to Planned Parenthood. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion in the South Carolina case, ruling that patients cannot sue states when they exclude abortion providers from Medicaid programs. This decision protects states and our rights to refuse subsidizing organizations that perform abortions, even when funding goes towards other services like contraception or cancer screenings. If they're going to that and subsidizing that, just means that they get to put that money towards other things, namely abortion, that we don't want. As for where this kind of comes from, this ruling, it stems from the South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster's 2018 executive order that barred abortion providers from receiving any state Medicaid funding. Planned Parenthood officials predict this will affect access to services, with CEO Rebecca Gibran stating that Idaho lawmakers will likely act on this opportunity. And I wouldn't disagree with her. Currently, Idaho already prohibits abortion, making this rule particularly relevant for preventing any taxpayer support of abortion-related organizations. We'll have to keep an eye on the 2026 legislative session for that. Conservative leaders, in conclusion, though, praise the decision as upholding the principles that no one should be forced to fund abortion providers through their tax dollars. This ruling empowers states to align their Medicaid programs with their values and protect families from supporting organizations that undermine their very life. It's hard to have a family if you don't have kids. And speaking of families, and one that sadly is a bit broken up at the moment, 2 teenagers from Jefferson County remain missing. And a national nonprofit now offers about $5,000 for their safe return. Alan Fisher, 13, and his sister, Rochelle, 15, vanished from their Mountain View home on June 22nd while their mother attended Bible study. The search has now expanded dramatically into Colorado, Arizona, and South Dakota following new leads. Investigators are focusing on a group called the Free Land Holders in Mancos, Colorado, which may be connected to their disappearance. The search expansion came after tips pointed to former FLDS compounds in these states. Elizabeth Roundy discovered her children gone when she returned that Sunday evening. She believes older siblings and members of the Fundamentalist Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints took Alan and Rochelle. Adding to her concerns, the children's older sister went missing from home in January of 2023 and has never been found. Randy previously belonged to this group, but was excommunicated in 2020. The Uvalde Foundation for Kids stepped forward to offer a reward. An Amber Alert remains active, and anyone with tips should call the Jefferson County's Sheriff's Office at 208-745-9210. And then coming back to lawsuits, the ACLU of Idaho has filed another one against our state last week. They just can't help themselves. This time challenging House Bill 135, which takes effect tomorrow. The law requires people to verify their legal immigration status before they can access certain publicly funded services, something that I think is also in the big beautiful bill, so depending on how this lawsuit goes, it may be null in here in a second. As for HB 135, it affects several programs, including HIV treatment, immunizations, prenatal care, and some food assistance programs. Emergency medical services remain available to everyone, so, if they're dying, they can get health care. It's just not for regular routine health-related things that are funded by taxpayers. The ACLU represents Dr. Abby Davids from the Full Circle Health and 5 immigrants with HIV who fear they'll lose access to medication. They want a judge to block the law before it takes effect. Dr. David worries about her patients who receive HIV medication through the federal Ryan White program. She claims that without treatment, HIV is universally fatal. As for the debate on it, Republican lawmakers who support the bill argue Idaho has limited resources. Senator Todd Lakely said during floor debate that, quote, "Careful use of these public funds is one of our primary responsibility as legislators," end quote. The ACLU argues that the law violates federal regulations and constitutional rights. Legal Director Paul Southwick called it, quote, "designed to dehumanize our immigrant neighbors," end quote. Before this law, people could access these specific benefits without proving legal status. Basically, they could get these benefits without paying tax dollars that are the thing that funds this. Kind of an oxymoron there. Now, verification is required for non-emergency services. The state's Attorney General office says they'll respond in court after reviewing the complaint. Did you know that there was even House Bill 135 that Idaho had banned giving money to immigrants? Or did you know about any of the other stories we talked about? If you didn't, please don't hesitate to share these stories, particularly the one you just heard, so people can know what's going on and be informed and engaged in our wonderful state. And speaking of our lawmakers, they are taking a hard look at what makes housing so expensive here in Idaho. Seems to be the number one thing us as Idahoans are frustrated about. The legislature's Land Use and Housing Study Committee met in Idaho Falls last month to examine the barriers that prevent builders from constructing affordable homes. The committee heard from house builders who explained how lengthy permit processes drive up costs and delay construction. Valley County Commissioner Sherry Maupin pointed out that, quote, "not in my backyard," end quote, opposition has increased litigation and slowed development since the 1960s. Other challenges include converting long-term rentals to short-term vacation properties and infrastructure demands, just trying to keep up with the building speed. The good news in all of this is that our legislature has already taken some steps/action this year on the topic. Senate Bill 1164 requires local governments to notify builders within 10 days if permit applications are incomplete, which should speed up the approval process. This represents a step towards removing bureaucratic obstacles rather than, hopefully, not expanding government programs. The committee will meet again in Sandpoint on August 14th, so if you're in the area, you might be able to listen to that, and Boise on September 26th before making recommendations to the 2026 legislative session. The focus remains on identifying regulatory barriers that government can remove to help the free market provide more housing options for Idaho families. And coming back to Trump, someone we can't get out of in the news cycle, his administration just handed our logging industry a major win. Agricultural Secretary Brooke Rollins announced that the federal government will rescind Clinton's 2001 roadless rule that has blocked logging access to 59 million acres of national forests. As for what this rule is, As we said, it is a Clinton-era rule that prevented companies from building roads they needed to harvest timber and manage forests properly. For over 2 decades, it has strangled our rural communities and left forests vulnerable to catastrophic wildfires. The most recent one I can remember is the one up by Grand Jean. It's really sad. If you don't want to cry, don't drive up that way. As for what this means for us, Idaho loggers can finally access areas that have been off limits since 2001. Companies can build roads they need to thin overgrown forests and harvest timber responsibly. This creates jobs right here in our rural towns while reducing our dependence on foreign timber. Kind of a crazy thing that we're reliant on it to a degree when we have so much here in Idaho and the nation. Granted, we've already made some headway on this. Idaho already works with federal agencies through the Good Neighbor Authority, but this change gives us more local control. Governor Little signed his own Make Forests Healthy Again Act earlier this year, which you may remember from our past midweek reports, putting state and federal governments on the same page for the first time in decades. Secretary Rollins called the old rule, quote, misguided, end quote, and said it created more wildfire risks. As you can guess, environmental groups oppose the change. But rural areas, where people actually live and work in these forests, know that proper forest management prevents the devastating fires that threaten our homes and wildlife and the general beauty of these areas. And staying on the Trump train and protecting the environment, President Trump has struck down a dangerous Biden policy that threatened our Snake River dams. On June 12th, Trump revoked Biden's 2023 moratorium that could have led to breaching 4 critical dams that power our state. This matters deeply for Idaho farmers and families. These dams generate over 3,000 megawatts of clean energy, keep our lights on, and cost low. Not to mention good fishing. That's a kind of an important thing to me. Without them, we face skyrocketing electrical bills, rolling blackouts, and far less clean power. Don't you want the environment to be clean? Just use hydro. Our wheat farmers would suffer the most. Idaho grows the nation's 2nd largest wheat crop. Take that, Kansas. Granted, maybe they might be corn. I'd have to look again. And half gets exported through the Columbia Snake River system. Dam breaching would spike grain transporting costs by 50 to 100% and threaten over 1,100 farms across the Northwest, mainly because then the waterway wouldn't be able to transport the goods that are there. Secretary of Energy Chris Wright praised Trump's actions, saying American tax dollars won't go towards, quote, dismantling critical infrastructure or radical nonsense policies, end quote. The Idaho Farm Bureau agrees as well, calling the dams, quote, critical, end quote, for wheat exports. Governor Little has long opposed dam breaching, noting it won't guarantee salmon recovery, the main reason for breaching them because, we got to protect the fishies. The 2020 federal study already concluded these dams should stay in place. Trump's decision protects Idaho jobs, keeps energy affordable, and preserves the infrastructure that makes our agricultural economy thrive. Common sense, for once, has prevailed over radical environmentalism. Key on that being radical. And then I know that most of this episode has been high stakes. And coming back to sports, college athletics keeps changing rapidly, and our Broncos face the same pressure as everyone else. Athletic Director Jeremiah Dickies wants to find new ways to pay for rising costs without taking on debt to pay student athletes directly. Next month, schools can start paying athletes directly under a new settlement, with a $20.5 million salary cap in the first year. Dickey knows we need more revenue streams to stay competitive as we move to a Pac-12. Might want to look up what exactly that is. We don't have time to get into that for now. The athletics department explored several options. They might partner with private developers to build on empty parking lots between Albertson Stadium and Broadway Avenue. They also want to add more club seats and concession areas to the stadium's east side. Dickey formed Bronco Athletics Growth Solutions, a for-profit company that could help fund future projects. He stresses they'll follow all state laws and policies since they're a public university and they'd never try to get around the legislature. I'll leave it at that. The department has already started building premium seats in the north end zone, replacing $199 season tickets with seats that cost $3,000 to $25,000. You're telling me Okay, I must be out of touch on that one. I didn't know you could pay that much for a Broncos seat. Dickies promises they'll still offer affordable options, though, for families who want to attend games. Hey, I know life is fast. Just give me 1 second here. If you don't want to miss out about learning more about Idaho, maybe consider subscribing/following us here on wherever you're listening, and also on our Substack. Because if you made it to this point in the meeting report, you probably love stuff about Idaho and should stay informed and engaged on what's going on with Idaho. And speaking of sports, our state's skiing industry just received welcome news from the Idaho Supreme Court. Last Wednesday, the court unanimously reversed its controversial 2023 decision that dismissed a wrongful death lawsuit against Sun Valley Resort. The case involved Dr. Stuart Milus of Boise, who died in November of 2019 after he crashed into a snowmaking tower while skiing. Milus was skiing with poor control on a lower river run when he slid across another skier's equipment, fell, and hit the bright yellow padded snow gun. His widow sued Sun Valley, but the district court originally threw out the case under our state's 1979 Ski Area Liability Act. When the Supreme Court reversed this dismissal in 2023, it sent shockwaves through Idaho's 19 ski areas, from Sun Valley down to small family hills. The December 2023 ruling threatened to drive up insurance costs and potentially force smaller resorts out of business, similar to what has happened in Vermont after a 1978 court decision. While ski operators celebrated the reversal of this, the court kept part of its earlier ruling that could still open doors to more lawsuits. Lawmakers need to clarify liability law when they reconvene in January. Speaking of the courts, and a more sadder note, the family of Victor Perez has officially filed a federal lawsuit against the Pocatello Police Department, making a significant development in this tragic case. Victor's grandfather and guardian, Luis Alyssa, spoke publicly for the first time, expressing his family's pain through an interpreter. Quote, "He was not an animal, and justice needs to be served," end quote. The lawsuit alleges officers violated Victor's civil rights and the Americans with Disability Act when they shot the 17-year-old autistic teen 9 times in April. John Burris, the civil rights attorney representing the family, argues that officers knew about Victor's disabilities from previous interactions, requiring them to use non-lethal alternatives. However, the situation officers faced was undeniably complex, responding to reports of someone with a knife who appeared to pose an immediate threat. While the Eastern Idaho Critical Incident Task Force continues investigating, this lawsuit will likely influence how law enforcement handles similar situations involving vulnerable individuals across our state. The case highlights the challenging balance between public safety and protecting those who cannot advocate for themselves. And speaking of enforcing the law, something that Boise is doing, very encouraging to hear. Boise City Council has approved changes to align Idaho's Galloway law, which takes effect July 1st. Unlike their flag situation, the council members actually updated their codes to match state requirements. The new ordinance prohibits public camping and sleeping on city property for cities over 100,000 people. Violations carry a $10 civil fine rather than criminal charges, so people can't face jail time or arrests. If you're curious about more on the law, we have that on our Substack on the bill that was passed for that. Police Chief Chris Dennison emphasized officers will offer resources before issuing citations. They'll connect people with services and use discretion. This approach earned support from homeless advocates who prefer civil infractions to criminal misdemeanors that create employment barriers. The law helps maintain clean, safe public spaces while providing a compassionate path forward. Rather than enabling street camping, it encourages people to use proper shelters, churches, and services. Boise continues to invest, though, in affordable housing and support programs. This balanced approach protects public health and safety while treating families with dignity. It shows that government can enforce reasonable standards without criminalizing poverty. True compassion means helping people get stable housing permanently, not allowing conditions that keep them on the streets. And coming to our last story, Boise-based Micron Technologies delivered remarkable financial results for its third quarter, with profits jumping nearly 6 times higher than last year. The memory chip maker earned $1.89 billion, or $1.68 per share, compared to just $332 million in the same quarter last year. Revenue climbed by 37% to $9.30 billion, beating analytic expectations. The surge comes after exploding demand for high-bandwidth memory chips that power artificial intelligence systems. CEO Sanjay Mehrotra reported that the data center revenue more than doubled year over year and reached a quarterly record. This boom for Idaho, looking at the impact, directly benefits our state as Micron expands its Boise headquarters with new fabrication plants and facilities. The company continues to pour billions into local operations, while pledging $75 million to supporting Idaho housing and infrastructure projects, something you'll know about if you listen to us regularly. Looking forward, Micron expects another 15% revenue increase next quarter as AI demand accelerates, or continues to. For a company that has weathered recent industry downturns and political controversies, this represents a stunning turnaround that strengthens Idaho's position in the global technology sector. It provides good-paying jobs for our communities. And speaking of stunning things, we've come to the end of the episode. I know it's so sad, but I gotta let you go so you can enjoy your 4th of July. But thank you for listening to the entire report. I sincerely hope you found it enjoyable and valuable. If you liked the midweek report, make sure to check out our other content. Also, if we missed any important points or provided incorrect information, please feel free to reach out to us via email or on Twitter by tweeting us at @LocalYokalIdaho. With the small team we have, we're not able to cover everything, but we do our best to cover the most interesting and important stories. Thank you for your continued support and assistance. That's all for now. I wish you a fantastic rest of your week. Godspeed.